Hi, I'm Brandon Donaldson, and have you wanted to debug, build, and deploy a Flutter web application? In this video, I will be covering using a Flutter web app with a Dart web server hosted on Elastic Beanstalk. So let's get started. Okay, so the first order of business, I just want to note where I put the code. I've got a GitHub repo, and I'll leave a link to this repo in the description below this video. And if I scan down to the bottom, I just want to list a note. I have an init reference section, and in this section, I cover installing Dart, installing the VS Code Dart plugin, and generating the application, and configuring the AWS and the EBL CLI tools, which I use to deploy the application to Elastic Beanstalk. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to cover the server, then the client, and both the client and server debugging together, and then I'll cover the deployment using Travis to Elastic Beanstalk. So to get started, I want to cover the server layout and configuration. And what I've done is used a Dart web server. And if you look, I have the pubsec.yaml instructions right at the base. And there's something interesting that you want to note in this configuration, because when I deployed to EC2, I want to house all the components. I want to house all the resources in its own standalone configuration. And what that means is I don't want to build a specific Docker container for EC2. And I could do that using ECS, but I don't want to do that. So I have some specific instructions that I just want to highlight. And that is when I declare the dependencies configuration, I'm using one dependency in this configuration. It's a simple config, and it's the MIME type, and it's version 3.1. Well, I come down and I declare a dependency override. What that allows me to do is copy the dependencies into the package directories. So let's take a look at that. Packages, pub, dartlang org, and then MIME type. So I look at the packages directory and I can see, since it's collapsed, I have the MIME type library loaded within the packages directory. So essentially, if you're familiar with NPM, it's like the node modules configuration where we load the libraries into, let's say, the node modules. In this case, it's the packages directory. This allows me to have a standalone web app which I can run and execute from EC2 when it's deployed using Elastic Beanstalk. Okay, so let's get to looking at the code. And if I go to the lib directory, I have a simple configuration, and it's called server.dart. I'm going to do a high-level flyover of this file and just cover the basics. Okay, so what I do is execute the server by calling dart server.dart, and this will start the entry point. This sets up the web server and binds to the local NIC on 8080. And then I set the execution path, and I use that later, and I'll show you why. I print some of the variables out in the console, and then it comes down and listens to requests coming into the server. And each request, it delegates to the handle request method. If I look at the handles request method, I pass in the request, I look at the URI, and then I divide it into two sections. One for static resources and one for server-side dynamically generated content. So if I go to handle API request, I send back JSON. If I send it to the handle static resources, I look up the file that I've put into the HTML directory here, and I pass that back and stream it back to the client. So if I look at the handle API request, I pass the request. This is where I look at the URI path, and if there's a /API, then pass back and write to the stream. The API works. How about trying API /get message? So if I pass in the URI or URL, API /get message, then I write a simple message, and the message is in JSON, and the property message contains the board is green. Okay, so I'll use that in my Flutter web app on the client side later in this episode. So if I go down to the handle static files requests, and it passes in the request, if I get a URI that actually ends with the /, that's telling me I should pass back the index, so I'll normalize the path and add on the index there. I, of course, do some debugging. I print out the path. I'll show you this in action a little bit here in a moment. And then I look up the file path based on what was passed in, and I load that and stream it back with this statement here. And if the file path doesn't exist, then I send back a 404. Okay, so that's pretty simple. Okay, so that covers my basic configuration. Now let's see what it looks like to start this project. Okay, so now how would I debug this? There's two ways I could do it. One from VS Code, and I could go to the run context and I can go up to 1 and launch server. But before I do that, I'm going to run it from the command line. So I'm going to go to the command line and I can click on the terminal here and it will take me to the debug console. I'll go to the terminal and let's say I could go right into that directory by right-clicking on the server and opening into the terminal. Okay, so I'll go Dart. And since I'm in the server directory and it's in the lib directory, so I've got to go lib. And I want to go server.dart. And this will start up the server. Okay, so you can see that I'm printing out some of the information so I can quickly go to it. In VS Code, I can quickly go command click or control click on it depending on the operating system. So I'm going to click on localhost. So it says temp file that will be replaced. And so later I'm going to show how to add the Flutter web contents to the HTML directory. But I don't want to do it in a hard-coded format where I have my server configuration. And I'll show how to glue that together in a moment. Okay, so back to VS Code. Okay, so that was one way to load it. And let me just look at the other files while I'm here. So I'm going to go to the API and just make sure they work. Okay, so API works. And then I'm going to click on API get message and the JSON output works. So that's great. Both the dynamically generated content and static resources work fantastic. Let me just remove the path altogether and check the index.html. So I'm going to hit enter and that's great. So I can tell that the index.html is getting added. So, or if I could go index.html, it's the same file. Okay, so that's fantastic. My web server is up and running and working. So let me see, I want to debug it in real time and so I can breakpoint on it, inspect the variables and so forth. So I'm going to stop the process in the CLI and I'm going to go over to VS Code and I've set up a launcher. But before I go there, I'm going to go to the launcher's configurations and look at 1, launch server. I also have 2, launch the Flutter web app, but I also have another 2, Flutter web app for production. And I'll cover that in a little bit. Okay, first off, launching the web server. If I look here, it's launching the program just like I did in the console or terminal, which is Dart, and then the path to server.dart. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that process. You can see the output is the exact same. So if I go to the directory and just do a command click, it says the temp file that will be replaced. The same thing as running it from the CLI. So that's easy. So if I go back, let's say I want to set a breakpoint, investigate the path that it's running on. I'm going to go to the file. I'm going to load up server.dart. And let's just say I want to add in handle request. I want to see how it's being handled. So I'll set a breakpoint right before let's go a little further down so I can inspect the variables too that are getting dynamically driven here. Okay, so I set a breakpoint, go back to the browser and reload it. Okay, great. It's paused on the code. Now I can inspect the variables. So I'm going to go to the debug context, back over to the left and click on that. And I can see over on the left the local variables that are declared and set. I can also look at the call stack to see how the path was driven. Okay, so that's great. So I'm going to resume. Okay, so that covers the nitty-gritty of debugging the Dart web server. Okay, so up next, I want to cover the Flutter web application. So I've created a Flutter web application and I named mine client. In this context, it's a simple application. So let me get to the code and I just want to look at the lib directory where I have the code. And I have 2 main entry points. And let's just start with those. I have the main_dev. And what I'm using is a flavor config, which allows me to provide different properties to my Dart application when I execute. Okay, so from VS Code, I run main.dev. From production, I run main. So if I look at main, I have a production URL. And if I look at main.dev, I have a development URL. Now, I could have other URLs depending on my configuration environments, but I won't cover that in great detail. I want to cover the two debugging patterns I'm going to go over today. One is local, and the other is running from Elastic Beanstalk. Okay, both main entry points, they delegate to my app. So what does my app do? So I won't cover how to configure all the UI here. What I want to cover quickly is what I do when I click on a button. I'll show that in a minute. And I fetch the server message, which is the JSON object, which is the JSON on the remote server. Then I use JSON decode to read the JSON into an object, and I pass that off to my server message, and then I use the JSON to create a server message object out of it, and then I pass that to update server message. And what that does is set the state and updates the UI. So how do I debug the Flutter web application? What I want to do is go over to the run context, and I've created a launcher for it, and it's number 2. And if I click on the launcher's configuration button, I get to the launch configurations, and I look at launch. It basically has an entry point. It says client lib main dev dart. So then it starts up the program main dev dart. And if I go back just to review, looking at main_dev, I can see localhost 8080. So this is going to use the server side. So in order to do both, I have to launch both the client and server together. So let's do that. So first thing I want to do is launch the server again. I stopped it earlier on. And if I go to launch server, I'm going to hit run. Then I want to hit launch Flutter web dev. And I'm going to hit run. And what this will do is start up the Flutter web application. So what I want to do is just make this a little bit smaller so I can fit the Flutter web app to the right. Okay, so the Flutter application loaded up. So that was fantastic. And you can see what I mean by a button. So I took the Flutter web application, slimmed it down to a simple button. So when I click on this button, it should return that data from the server and update the UI. Okay, so fantastic. It updated the UI and took that JSON message and painted it onto the application. I have a simple Flutter web application that does an HTTP request to my Dart web server, and it fetches the board is green. So now that I've simply demonstrated how I can run and debug server and the Flutter web application locally with VS Code, how would I glue this together and deploy it to Elastic Beanstalk? So let's look at the build instructions on how to do that and look at the configuration I use for Elastic Beanstalk. So what I want to do is review my Elastic Beanstalk configuration. Now I've already set up a project and generated that, and you can reference how I generated the Elastic Beanstalk configuration in the README. So if I look at config.yaml, and I can see that I'm going to deploy to my environment named Dart servers -staging-v1, and the application name will be debugging-dart-web server. I use this in another Dart web server only video, so if you want to see that, take a look at my YouTube channel and you'll see where that's at. Okay, so now I've set up the Elastic Beanstalk configuration with the init instructions in my README. I want to cover what I have here for my instructions to build this. So I have the build.sh. These are my simple build instructions of how I glue everything together. I have the debug-docker-container-config.sh file, which I use this file to emulate my Docker config, which is run by the Docker run configuration on EC2 or Elastic Beanstalk. This shell script also is using the Docker file. These two files have nothing to do with the AWS deployment, and I really want to highlight that it has nothing to do with this. The Docker run is the Docker file instructions for running the AWS or Docker container on AWS or EC2. So if I look at the Docker file instructions for EC2, when it's loaded on EC2, it will set up a source path to the source named var app current. And then the container definitions, and I'm using a multi-container format, and I only have one container on it, and it's named web app. I won't cover all the nitty-gritty here, and I haven't optimized. but follow me for more videos in the future and I'll cover this in greater detail. So I'm using a Dart image, and in that Dart image I'm setting a mount point to the source, which is named web app. In the container hosted /app will map the source, so that means I can run a command dart app dist lib server.dart. Okay, so how do I get this configuration set up so I can deploy it? So I build using the build script here. So in this, I create the dist directory, then I go into the server directory and get the packages, update the packages for the server directory. And then I go into the client directory and I build it with Flutter pub-get, and then I use Flutter build web so I can build the web app. Then after the server's built and the client's built, I go into the server directory and copy that to the dist directory. And then I copy the client web output or the web resources to the dist directory's HTML directory. I'll show you how that looks in a moment. And then at the end of the show, I take the dist directory and I run pub-get so it rewires the package instructions. So let's see that in action. I'll go to the terminal, but I'm in the client, so I'll go cd up one directory, and then I want to run sh because I didn't set execute permissions on the file, so then I'll go build.sh. And this will run the build process. This will take a couple minutes, and then I'll look at the dist directory. Okay, great. It's done. It's built the dist directory. So let's take a look at that. Minimize the other ones. And in this dist directory, you'll see that I have the server configuration as the root of the project. And you'll see when I look in the lib, I have the packages, so that's important. So now when I load this up to EC2, all I would have to do is call dart lib server.dart and it will execute the process. So I want to show how to debug that locally to make sure everything is wired up and ready to go. But before I do that, let's look at the HTML directory. And in the HTML directory, the Flutter web app exists. So this is a fantastic way to use Flutter to build a web project. Okay, so how do I debug this dist directory? Well, I'm going to go to the terminal and emulate the environment. And the very first way is I'll use the command line to execute the Dart server process. Let's get into that directory, cd dist, and then I want to run Dart, and I'll go, I guess that's lib, and then server.dart. As long as I don't have the other debug processes running, it'll work fine. Otherwise, I get port conflicts. So I'm going to go ahead and load it up. Okay, great. The app loaded up, and let me try to make sure the server side is wired up correctly. Okay, the board is green. Okay, great. It works from the command line. So I'm going to terminate the process. There's another way to debug it, and that is run eb local run. And this will start up the Docker run instructions as a local Docker container, a Google Dart image. It'll load that up and run that process. And that allows me to emulate the EC2 configuration. I won't cover that in this video. I have another video and I'll link that in the description below. But if you want to find out more about that, check that out. I'll go directly to the next step, and that is to deploying it. Okay, I'm ready for deployment. So how do I do that? I use Travis to deploy my web application to Elastic Beanstalk. So let me look at the Travis instructions in the .travis.yaml file. And if you look at the top, I have a Dart configuration for the Travis environment. And then in the before script, I run several commands. And what I do is fetch Flutter. I export it to the path. I run Flutter upgrade. And then I use Flutter config enable web. I use Flutter doctor just to output to verify things go right. Okay, so the magic really happens in the script. I run that same build command. It builds a dist directory. And what I do is remove the orphans that I no longer need in the directories. So that way I don't have a huge footprint to send to S3. So I remove the client, server, and Flutter because the dist directory contains all the contents I want to deploy on EC2. And then the real magic that Travis makes great is it has a configuration for deploying to Elastic Beanstalk, App Engine, and so forth. By the way, keep your eyes peeled. I'll show how to do the same thing deploying to App Engine near future. So I've set the provider to Elastic Beanstalk. Well, I have the access key and access keys. You can see they're an encrypted hash. Now I talk about how I generate that hash and the instructions below. Now, if you want to see that in greater detail, I have another video, and I'll link that in the video description on how to generate that. Essentially, it deploys to the S3 bucket and then eventually makes its way to the Elastic Beanstalk, and Elastic Beanstalk then delegates it to an EC2 instance depending on the configuration and how many I want to load it on, and so forth. Okay, so what I do to deploy to this, I don't have a branch configuration here, so all I have to do is commit to master, and it will update the website. So what I want to do, I have a change already staged, and it's just some comments. And what I want to do is updated. I'll just do a quick commit, and what I want to use git lands, and I'll just push it up to the GitHub repo. Okay, so I'll go to the GitHub repo and just verify the commits in. I can see I pushed up the commit. If I go to Travis now, okay, so now that I'm on Travis, it saw the commit, it's going to start to build this. This will take several minutes, just like it did on my local system, and what it will do at the end is deploy to the Elastic Beanstalk. Okay, so it's starting to run the deployment. What it's doing is it's copying that disk directory in a zip to Elastic Beanstalk. Okay, so it's finished deploying, so I can go over to Elastic Beanstalk, and if I refresh the Elastic Beanstalk config here, I should see the health start to spin. Now what it's doing is it's deploying to the EC2 instance. And by the way, if you get stuck and something's hung and it's not wired properly, you're going to see that configuration error show up in the logs. I won't cover that in this video. I have another one, just like I said earlier, and I'll link that in the video description. Okay, great. The health is checked in as green, so it's ready to go. Let's test it. So I'm going to go command click on the URL, and I haven't added a CNAME for it, so it's just the standard deployment config URL. So it opens, and there's my Flutter web app. So if I've wired up the server side correctly, try local request will call that production URL, and if I click it, the board is green. So that's fantastic. That means it's all wired up correctly. So that concludes debugging, building, and deploying the Flutter web application using a Dart web server on Elastic Beanstalk. So thanks for watching today. Follow me for more tips and tricks on debugging, and I'll catch you later.